Cass Gilbert was born in Zanesville, Ohio on November 24, 1859. When he was 9 years old, his family moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, where his father was working as a surveyor. Shortly after the move, Cass's father died, leaving Cass and his two brothers in the care of their mother. Elizabeth Gilbert made sure the three boys finished their schooling, which prepared Cass for his internship following his formal primary education.
Cass Gilbert's education in architecture looks much different than what an architect's education would look like today. In the 1870s, apprenticeships without formal education were the standard. This was actually transitioning as Cass was entering the field. Cass Gilbert attended preparatory school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and in 1876 he began his architectural training in St. Paul at the office of Abraham and Radcliffe. He was there about 18 months and then went to work for surveying for the Hudson River Falls Railroad in Wisconsin. Cass Gilbert actually attended 1 year of a 2-year architectural drafting program at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. The school was run by Eugene Latain, a French Beaux Arts trained architect, which could have influenced Cass Gilbert's mastery of Beaux Arts architecture. After leaving MIT, Gilbert worked for the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Surveying. In the early 1880s, Gilbert traveled to France, Italy, and England. He sketched and painted watercolors of buildings and villages. His artwork became a frame of reference for his architectural work. He eventually returned to New York and worked at the office of McKim, Mean, and White. Then eventually he headed the firm's office in Minnesota.
After his primary schooling, Cass Gilbert began an apprenticeship with the architect Abraham Radcliffe in St. Paul, Minnesota. 2 years later, he enrolled at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to study under the architect William Robert Ware. In 1879, he left the program to work as a surveyor and travel through Europe, during which time he began sketching the architecture throughout the European countryside. That influenced his later work. Returning to New York, he became the assistant to Stanford White at the architectural firm McKim, Mead, and White. Still at that firm, he moved back to Minnesota in 1882. In 1885, he partnered with James Taylor Knox to design buildings all around the upper Midwest and worked with him until 1891. Early in his career in St. Paul, Gilbert was connected with the McKim, Mead, and White architectural firm, as well as partnered with James Taylor Knox. Working for the former, he designed public structures such as the Northern Pacific Railroad Hospital. He also designed functional buildings like the Blood Warehouse for private corporate clients. Renamed the Gilbert Building in the 1980s, the Blood Warehouse was one of Gilbert's first well-known projects. Both buildings pictured were completed in 1883. Gilbert's first solo residential project was actually a house for his mother, the Elizabeth Gilbert House. He followed this with more residences in the early 1880s, such as the J.Q. Adams House, all vaguely similar, with a basic rectangular structure adorned with gables, trimmed windows, and peaked roofs.
Cass Gilbert returned to New York, where his work designing commercial buildings really expanded, notably with the Woolworth Building, which when it was completed in 1913 was the tallest building in the world, and the New York Life Insurance Company building. These are two examples of Gilbert's Gothic architectural style, featuring pointed arches, lines, finials, and intricate details, which evokes images of European cathedrals. Perhaps he was deducing from his time in Europe and using his watercolor paintings and sketches as inspiration. Gilbert's design of civic buildings also grew during this time period. This would include the Detroit Public Library, which Gilbert won the design competition for in 1914, the Detroit Public Library being an example of his work in Renaissance Revival style. The last building that Cass Gilbert designed was the incredible Supreme Court building. This is a fine example of the neoclassicalism architecture. The building has a deep portico and fluted Corinthian-style columns. Cass Gilbert was actually handpicked by President Taft to design the U.S. Supreme Court building. Gilbert actually died before the completion of the project, and his son Cass Jr. and his associate John R. Rockart finished the project.
Gilbert designed 4 libraries in his career. the University of Texas Library, the Detroit Public Library, the Ives Memorial Library, and the St. Louis Public Library. All four library projects overlapped, with ground being broken between 1907 and 1913. Gilbert believed that the architecture of an academic building, such as a library, should convey the dignity of its purpose. As can be seen in his library designs, they are not as ostentatious as his famous Woolworth building, being more reserved in their silhouette. All of his libraries, and most of his portfolio, are done in the Beaux Arts style. With roots in classic Greek and Roman styles, the structures are all based on symmetry. The Ives Memorial Library even features traditional columns, and all the others include arched windows and flat roofs. All libraries were made of stone, mainly brick and marble, and the simple yet intricate designs and natural materials place the focus on what the building houses, not the building itself. When entering a Gilbert library, you will be impressed by the facade, but your focus will be on the books.
Cass Gilbert really left his indelible mark all across the United States, from railroad depots in North Dakota, which still stand and have been repurposed, to the stunning Minnesota State Capitol, churches, private residences. He also influenced the design of skyscrapers, which dominate urban areas like New York City, civic buildings like the U.S. Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. His work designing public libraries paid tremendous attention to the user's experience. His mastery of many types of architecture, from Beaux Arts to Gothic to Classic Revivalism, demonstrate the breadth of his ability. He recognized that a building's architecture was about structural integrity, aesthetic appeal, function, and people. Cass Gilbert's buildings still stand. They are still in use. His buildings are not only on the National Register of Historic Places, but they are actually landmarks that represent ideals.